Imagine a professional sporting event so disastrous that it nearly killed half the participants. Imagine a race where the first man across the finish line arrived in a car, the second man was hallucinating on rat poison, and a third runner was chased a mile off course by a pack of feral dogs. You might think you know history. You might think marathon running is just a boring test of endurance, but you have never heard a story quite like the 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis. It wasn't just a race, it was a carnival of pain, stupidity, and accidental science experiments that arguably stands as the single weirdest event in American sports history. Let's go back to a sweltering August day in Missouri where 32 men lined up to run and chaos ensued. Part 1. The Perfect Storm. The date was August 30th, 1904. The location was St. Louis, Missouri. The United States was hosting its first ever Olympic Games, but they were treated as a mere sideshow to the massive World's Fair happening at the same time. From the very beginning, the marathon was doomed. To start with, the course was designed by sadists. Instead of flat, paved roads, the organizers chose a brutal 24.85-mile route that wound through 7 distinct hills. The roads weren't roads at all. They were dirt paths, inches deep in dust. Traffic wasn't blocked off. The runners had to dodge delivery wagons, railroad trains, furious pedestrians, and people walking their dogs. But the real killer was the heat. It was 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, in the shade, with humidity so thick you could chew it. In modern times, a race like this would be canceled immediately. In 1904, they didn't just let it happen, they made it harder on purpose. Enter James Sullivan, the chief organizer of the Games. Sullivan wanted to use the marathon to test a scientific theory called purposeful dehydration. He believed that drinking water during exercise was a sign of weakness and physically harmful. So, for the entire 25-mile race in 90 degrees heat, there were only 2 water stations, one at the 6-mile mark and one at the 12-mile mark. That was it. Sullivan was essentially using human beings as lab rats to see how long they could survive before collapsing. As it turned out, the answer was not very long. Part 2. The Cast of Characters. The starting lineup was a motley crew that looked less like elite athletes and more like the cast of a bad sitcom. There were a handful of experienced American marathoners, including Sam Miller, who had won the Boston Marathon, and Thomas Hicks, a brass worker from Massachusetts, who was the favorite to win. Then there was Fred Lors. Fred was a bricklayer by trade and a prankster by nature. He hadn't trained much, but he figured he'd give it a shot. Representing Cuba was a man named Felix Carvajal. Felix was a postman who had raised money to come to the Olympics by running around the entire country of Cuba begging for change. When he arrived in New Orleans, he lost all his money in a dice game. He had to walk and hitchhike all the way to St. Louis. He arrived at the starting line minutes before the gun went off, wearing heavy street shoes, long trousers, and a button-down shirt. A fellow athlete took pity on him and used scissors to cut his pants into makeshift shorts. And perhaps most interesting of all were Len Tauniane and Jan Mashiani. They were Swana tribesmen from South Africa who weren't actually in St. Louis for the Olympics. They were there to take part in a Boer War reenactment at the World's Fair. They had never run a marathon before, but they ran barefoot and seemed eager. They became the first black Africans to compete in the modern Olympics. At 3:03 p.m., under the blazing afternoon sun, the gun fired. The disaster had begun. Part 3. The Dust and the Dogs. As the runners took off, they were immediately engulfed in a choking cloud of dust. The organizers had allowed cars and support vehicles to drive ahead of the runners. The tires kicked up so much dirt that the athletes were coughing up black slime within miles. William Garcia of California was one of the first casualties. The dust coated his esophagus and ripped apart his stomach lining. He collapsed on the side of the road, vomiting blood. He was rushed to a hospital where doctors said if he had stayed in the dust for 1 hour longer, he would have bled to death internally. Meanwhile, the Cuban postman, Felix Carvajal, was actually doing quite well. Despite his heavy shoes, he was keeping a good pace. However, Felix hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. As he ran, he spotted an apple orchard. Starving, he stopped the race, jumped a fence, and ate some green apples. Unfortunately, the apples were rotten. Felix developed severe stomach cramps. He lay down on the side of the road and took a nap. Yes, in the middle of the Olympic marathon, he took a nap. Amazingly, he would wake up later and keep running. Elsewhere on the course, the South African runners were having their own problems. Len Tauniane was a talented runner and probably could have won the whole thing. He was running a strong race until he encountered a uniquely American obstacle: feral dogs. A pack of wild dogs chased Tauniane off the road. He had to run a mile out of his way just to escape being mauled. Despite running a mile further than everyone else, he still managed to finish 9th. Part 4. The Cheater. By the 9-mile mark, Fred Lors, the bricklayer, was done. The heat had broken him. He suffered severe cramps and decided to drop out. He flagged down one of the support automobiles and asked for a ride back to the stadium to get his clothes. He hopped in the car, waved at the suffering runners as he passed them, and enjoyed the breeze. However, about 19 miles into the course, the car broke down. Fred, now rested and feeling refreshed after riding in a car for 11 miles, decided, why not? He jumped out of the broken car and started jogging again. Fred Lors entered the Olympic Stadium to a roar of applause. He crossed the finish line first with a time of roughly 3 hours and 13 minutes. The crowd went wild. Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was there to crown him the winner. Just as she was about to place the laurel wreath on his head, someone from the support crew burst in, screaming, "He's a fraud! He was in a car!" Fred smiled and claimed he was just joking. He said he never intended to accept the medal, he just wanted to see what it felt like to cross the line. The officials were not amused. He was banned from racing for life, though the ban was lifted a year later.
Part 5. The Experiment on Thomas Hicks. While Fred was enjoying his car ride, the real leader of the race, Thomas Hicks, was entering a living nightmare. Hicks was about 10 miles from the finish when he began to collapse from dehydration. Remember, there was no water. His trainers, who were committed to the scientific experiment, refused to give him water. Instead, they decided to give him a performance-enhancing drug. In 1904, there were no rules against doping, so his trainers mixed up a special cocktail, strychnine and egg whites. Strychnine is rat poison. In small doses, it acts as a stimulant. In large doses, it kills you instantly. Hicks downed the rat poison and kept shuffling forward. A few miles later, he collapsed again. His trainers looked at him, pale, hallucinating, barely conscious, and decided the best solution was more rat poison. They gave him a second dose, this time washing it down with brandy. Hicks was now technically running on a mixture of poison and alcohol in 90-degree heat. He began to hallucinate. He believed the finish line was 20 miles away. It was only 2. His body was shutting down. For the last mile, Thomas Hicks did not run. He didn't even walk. His trainers literally carried him, holding him up by his arms while his feet dragged through the dirt. He was hallucinating that he was a machine. When they reached the stadium, his trainers dragged him across the finish line. His feet were moving back and forth in the air, pretending to run, but he wasn't touching the ground. Hicks collapsed immediately. He had lost 8 pounds during the race. Doctors rushed to him. If he had taken one more dose of strychnine, he would have died on the spot. He was declared the winner, mostly because he was the first guy to cross the line who hadn't ridden in a car. The aftermath. Out of the 32 men who started the race, only 14 finished. Thomas Hicks, USA, won gold, surviving the rat poison. He never ran another marathon again. Albert Corey, France, took silver. He survived by finding discarded food on the ground. Arthur Newton, USA, took bronze. Felix Carvajal, the Cuban postman, finished 4th despite stopping to nap and having food poisoning. If he hadn't eaten those apples, he likely would have won gold. The race was such a catastrophe that the Olympic Committee considered banning the marathon from the Olympics forever. They thought it was man-killing and impossible for humans to do safely. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon remains a testament to human stupidity and resilience. It was a race run on dirt, fueled by poison, disrupted by dogs, and won by a man who was technically unconscious when he finished. History is often boring. It's often about treaties and dates. But sometimes, history is just a Cuban postman napping in an orchard while an American takes rat poison to win a gold medal. And that is amazing.